Thanks, John, for the invitation to be here. It's great to be here, and great to have an opportunity, actually, to read this Bastiat, or whatever he is, Bastiat essay. And I mean, one thing at least I've learned is that there's controversy around the pronunciation. Again, and focus on it. I thought I'd begin by telling you a story that does the rounds among economists, or at least it used to, about Bob Solow introducing a paper by Milton Friedman. And Bob said this, he said, everything makes Milton Friedman think about money. Everything, he said, makes me think about sex, and I managed to keep it out of my papers. Well, I guess money and sex are all very well in their own way, but these days everything makes me think about expressive voting, and in this particular case, I think it does bear, and so it intrudes into the paper in a central way. So what I want to do is to sort of bring to bear the insight that I see as central to the expressive voting account and interpret and interrogate this essay in the light of that. So, in the expressive voting stuff, the central distinction is between a preference that's merely expressed, preference between X and Y, or whatever it is, and one that, in the nature of the expression, is determinative over the option that you receive. Okay, so it's determinative over the outcomes. And the characteristic distinction here is between market choice, between X and Y, whatever it is, where the opportunity cost of choosing X is Y foregone, and the electoral case where the choosing to vote for X is not Y foregone, merely a vote for Y foregone. And so the issue is, in what way does the presence of having to deal with the consequences of your actions, as it were, impact on the kinds of considerations that weigh in generating the preference. Now, in large-scale elections, the distinction between the market choice, as it were, where the opportunity cost is X foregone, and the electoral choice, the choice of the ballot box, is very significant. I mean, the probability that you will be decisive in an electoral context is asymptotically negligible. That seems to me to be an important decision-theoretic difference between behaviour at the ballot box and behaviour in the marketplace. Choice between Trump and Clinton versus choices to assets portfolios. And I'm going to treat, although of course this is a continuum in a way, I'm going to treat this distinction as sort of quasi-categorical. I began with one story, let me tell another. This is about my grandson, who bears my name, Geoffrey. At the swimming pool, Geoffrey was instructed by his mother to get out of the water. And he didn't. And so she threatened him. She said, look, if you don't get out of the water, I'm not going to buy you an ice cream after we swim. That's the normal routine. And he still didn't get out of the water, and so time came to buy the ice creams. Eventually he was pulled out by his ear, and Bethany and Audrey each got an ice cream, and Geoffrey didn't. And needless to say, he complained about this, and Robin, his mother, said to him, well, look, Geoffrey, you've just got to realise that there are consequences of your actions. Geoffrey sat there and he pouted. He said, I don't like consequences. Sweet. Lots of people don't like consequences because consequences have the effect of disciplining you in a way that the absence of consequences frees you. And that freedom can, in some cases, be a good thing. This is not directly a normative claim, but it is a claim about the difference between cases in which the consequences bear directly on the actor and the case in which the consequences of your action are asymptotically irrelevant. As Hartmut Klint says about the ballot box, there's a veil of insignificance that's characteristic of electoral behaviour. Now, what I want to do is to just remind you, as I see it anyway, of the central point of the essay at hand. I won't pronounce his name, in case I get it wrong. And as I see it, there are just these 4 points, and I've put them on this list, and I'll run through them, because there's a distinction, Bastiat says, between immediate and subsequent effects. The former tend to be seen, and the latter tend to be unseen. In other words, the distinction that Bastiat makes is one that's connected to time. It's between immediate and subsequent. Now, I want to say that maybe that's right, maybe it's wrong. This will crop up again later on in the way in which various people interpret what's at stake here. Here's the second thing. The seen-unseen distinctions played out in reference to good and bad economists. I'm only half an economist these days, but I took some umbrage at this, in the sense that why make the economists the bad guys? After all, for him, what an economist is here is somebody who's assessing an act or a habit or an institution or a law. But lots of people are called on to do that, including, not least, citizens in the electorate when it comes to habits and institutions, and certainly with laws. Bad economists see only the immediate effects, good economists see all the effects. Okay, the third proposition is that there's, not invariably, but almost always, an inverse relation between the desirability of the immediate effects and the desirability of the subsequent effects. So if the immediate effect is favourable, then later consequences, the unseen features, tend to be disastrous, and vice versa. And then finally, the proposition that these general claims translate from the economic sphere, the sphere of evaluations of acts, habits, institutions and laws, to health and morals. Well, I want to interrogate these various claims. But first of all, let me say that, in principle, it seems to me, the claim that the good economist is one that takes account of all effects, the bad economist is one that takes account of only some of the effects, is so unexceptionable as to be uninteresting, actually. So there's no doubt that it seems to me that the bad economist is a bad economist. So that might be contentious in some circles, but I think it's true. So my interest is not so much in looking at the normative consequences of different, activities, though I think this is what Bastiat is great at, ripping up the rails of the transport system and so on. But rather, why is there so much bad economics around? Because that seems to me to be a question on which economics as such can throw some light. So, and that's where, of course, the expressive voting thing comes in, because I take it that the central insight of Bastiat is that differential salience is a very important influence on people's attitudes towards actions, laws, habits, institutions. That differential salience plays a really critical role. That is the distinction between the relatively seen and the relatively unseen. And that's what I take that distinction to be about. It's not a categorical distinction, it's a distinction of degree, and it's about what elements are salient and what are not. And in the essay itself, I think there hover two different kinds of explanations of this phenomenon. One is an acrasia-like explanation. It's the suggestion that, look, it's like, to take the sort of health example, it's like the tempting piece of cake which you know you shouldn't eat, so on and so on. I'm undissuaded by that. I think that's not a very persuasive interpretation of it, though I think Bastiat himself may hover on the edge of that. I don't think that's what the problem is here. I think the problem is rather that most of our attitudes are formed in a setting where the attitudes themselves are not disciplined by consequences. And in this connection, if that's true that what happens in these environments might be thought of as in terms of downs in rational ignorance. You just focus on the face of things because things on their face are self-evident, they're easy to obtain information about, whereas in things that are more subtle, you've got to work hard to understand them. Maybe you need a degree in PPE or something. So the down to rational ignorance point is that people at the ballot box will be, in inverted commas, rationally ignorant. And of course, it's not just at the ballot box that will be true, it will be true more generally in other circumstances where the circumstances that apply in the electoral setting apply more generally. So, in particular, all those circumstances where people form their attitudes and opinions independently of having to confront the consequences of those opinions. And I want to make several observations about this. First of all, I want to say, look, salience is not necessarily connected to time. I mean, I think that there are lots of instances that we can think of where the short run is not salient and the long run is. I think that's true, actually, of the climate change debate. All the evidence suggests that actually any warming associated with climate change effects associated with increased carbon emissions in the short run, in the next 10, 15 years, may actually be beneficial. It's by 2150 that the bad news comes, and that bad news is certainly salient for a large number of people, Green voters and people who are concerned about what happens in the long term. So the idea that it's just sort of either an empirical regularity or as it was self-evident that it's the immediacy of the effect that's relevant, I think that's not true. It might be the immediacy of the news about the effect that's relevant. After all, the term news is an interesting term, right? News is new. But I take it that the news as such can be about effects that are occurring some distance away in time. I certainly see no argument for in the paper and no general presumption as to why there's a reverse relation between the seen and unseen effects. In some interesting cases, no doubt there is, that would be characteristic of the acrasia cases. But I think that, as I say, those cases aren't the ones that best explain the phenomenon that we're dealing with. Okay? I don't see any reason why the salient effects and the non-salient effects will go in opposite directions. It just seems to me that they're not systematically related in either way, and that means if you ignore the non-salient features, the subtle features of policies, acts, institutions, or whatever, then in half the cases you'll be ignoring things that are relevant and suggest action in a different direction. And finally, this question about, well, how about the translation of this insight from the arena of acts, habits, institutions and laws to the case of health and morals? And I want to again question, it seems to me that this is not cutting the distinction at its joints, as it were, to think that, look, there's just a direct extrapolation from this case, because on my reading it depends whether the attitudes that are generated, the attitudes that are expressed, the expressive preferences, if you like, that are a characteristic feature of cases of inconsequential action, whether they are applied to health and morals, or whether the decisions about health and morals are individuated in such a way that the individual has to bear the consequences of her own actions. And, you know, just take the health example. I think the moral case is interesting in a number of dimensions, but just take the health cases. It seems to me, you know, in the private health system, you know, an individual's told by his doctor, look, you've got a condition, if you don't do something about it, you know, in 5 years you'll be dead, but if you do something about it now, we can go and cut the growth out now, and everything will be fine. This is a no-brainer. I mean, everybody goes in and has the day operation of having the growth removed, even though, you know, it's the distance, the consequences of this are remote. You know, that's not an issue about, you know, or how salient it is, or I'm really worried about the pain that would be associated with it. I think that's just not a problem in most cases where individuals are making private health decisions. Okay? The public health system is another thing where large numbers of individuals vote on, you know, who will be saved or how will we allocate health research and so on. There, you know, each individual is not dealing with the consequences of her own particular views. It's natural to focus on the diseases that are salient and, you know, not ask too many questions about it, because trying to inform yourself really seriously about these things is a costly matter, and it is entirely rational, as Down says, to not worry about those things. And, you know, to take an example that I refer to in the paper, there's a literature in public choice about concentrated benefits and distributed costs. This is the Olsonian idea that a characteristic problem with politics is that things that have concentrated benefits and diffuse costs are much more likely to get up, even if the aggregation of the costs is considerably in excess of the benefits. And he casts that argument as a sort of an argument about the fact that when the benefits are more concentrated, it's easier for the people who are beneficiaries to get together and lobby government and have political influence and so on. But, I mean, I don't want to deny that that's one aspect of the story, though I think the arguments about how easy it is to get, you know, the farming community together to lobby for farm support and so on. But it's not obvious to me that it's any easier to do that than to get together larger groups to lobby for their interests. But what I do think is the following fact: the jobs, you know, the jobs talk, things, the rhetoric that's appealed to in relation to tariffs and so on. The jobs lost a salient. You can go to the town and see Detroit and see that, you know, this is a place in chaos. And whereas the fact that, you know, this international competition in the car market, you know, has reduced the price of cars by 10%, let's say, you know, it's much more difficult to represent that as a salient fact. Okay? Loss of jobs, jobs rhetoric, jobs are salient because we can point to a particular person who's been unemployed. Everybody faces, you know, a modest increase in the price of something by virtue of the fact that the government has intervened, but that's not electorally significant in the way that job losses are. So the whole, as I see it, of the jobs rhetoric in politics is associated with an issue of differential salience. Nobody talks about, you know, the net effects, of course. Well, that's not true. Lots of economists, good economists do, but what is to be the enemy here is, as I see it, this property of differential salience. It's not, I think, so much Olson's diagnosis of relative ease of getting together a group and lobbying the community. Okay. Okay. Time for me to shut up now. I'll get a chance to say some more in discussion perhaps, but thanks for your attention.
Thanks.